He was a titan in a world of glass towers and golden parachutes. A man who believed that everything, every person, every moment, every inconvenience, could be solved with the right amount of money and the correct tone of authority. Marcus Aldridge, CEO of Aldridge Global Holdings, didn't just move through life. He carved through it like a yacht through still water, leaving waves of disruption in his wake. She was a shadow in sensible shoes, a woman who had learned that survival meant swallowing pride, smiling through exhaustion, and carrying trays heavier than the weight of her own shattered dreams. Her name tag read Sophie, but to most of the clientele at the Meridian Club, she was simply Miss or You There, or nothing at all. Just a function, a service, a forgettable face in the background of their extraordinary lives. Their collision was inevitable, not because fate cared about justice or poetic symmetry, but because arrogance, when left unchecked, eventually blinds a man to the very ground beneath his feet. On a humid Thursday evening in downtown Chicago, in a restaurant where the wine list read like a mortgage payment, and the dress code was enforced with military precision, one man's casual cruelty would detonate a reckoning 15 years in the making. It would begin with a steak cooked 3 degrees too rare. It would escalate with 4 words, barked across a hushed dining room, "Get me your manager." But it would end with something far more dangerous than anger. Far more dangerous than embarrassment. It would end with a name, a single surname written on a leather check presenter, a name that would drain the color from Marcus Aldridge's face, and rewrite the power dynamic of the entire evening, 'cause some ghosts don't rattle chains. Some ghosts simply return your credit card, with a smile that knows exactly who you are, what you did, and how much you thought you'd gotten away with. And the most terrifying truth of all, she had been standing right there, refilling his water glass for the past 45 minutes, watching him with eyes that remembered everything. The Meridian Club wasn't just a restaurant. It was a cathedral of excess, a temple where the liturgy was spoken in the language of Wagyu beef, aged Burgundy, and the hushed reverence reserved for those who could afford to spend a middle-class salary on a single meal. The walls were paneled in reclaimed mahogany from a 19th century English manor, and the chandeliers, genuine Murano glass, each one a small fortune suspended in crystalline beauty, cast a warm, amber glow that made everyone look 10 years younger. And infinitely more important, the air itself seemed filtered, scrubbed clean of the city's grit, and replaced with the delicate perfume of saffron, truffle oil, and old money. It was the kind of place where senators dined with lobbyists, where CEOs brokered deals that would shutter factories and birth empires, where the very act of eating became a performance of power. Marcus Aldridge sat at table 12, the best table in the house, positioned in a corner alcove with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago River. The city lights shimmered against the dark water like a constellation fallen to earth. He wore a navy Brioni suit that cost more than most people's cars, and his watch, a limited edition Patek Philippe Nautilus, caught the light every time he gestured, which was often. At 51, Marcus had the kind of face that had aged into authority. A sharp jawline, silver threading through his dark hair, eyes the color of gunmetal, eyes that could calculate a quarterly earnings report in seconds, but had never once calculated the cost of cruelty. Across from him sat 2 associates, Gerald and Philip, men who laughed at his jokes with the desperate enthusiasm of those whose mortgages depended on his approval. They were discussing the Vermeer acquisition, a hostile takeover that would gut a 100-year-old family business and add another billion to Aldridge Global's portfolio. Sophie moved through the dining room like a ghost, navigating a world that pretended she didn't exist. Her uniform was crisp, black slacks, white shirt, a burgundy vest embroidered with the Meridian Club's gold crest. Her dark hair was pulled back in a tight bun, not a strand out of place. Her face, at 36, still carried traces of the beauty she'd once possessed. Before exhaustion had etched itself into the corners of her eyes, before late rent notices and double shifts had taught her that hope was a luxury she could no longer afford. She'd been at the Meridian Club for 8 months. Before that, it was the Brass Griffin. Before that, Luminaire. Before that, a dozen other restaurants whose names blurred together. A monotonous parade of entitled customers and aching feet. She was good at her job, invisible when she needed to be, efficient, professional. She knew how to read a table, how to anticipate needs before they were spoken, how to smile with her mouth while keeping her eyes carefully blank. What the customers didn't know, what they would never think to ask, was that Sophie Laurent had once been someone else entirely. Dr. Sophie Laurent, Associate Professor of Economics at Northwestern University, a rising star, published in the Journal of Economic Perspectives, a consultant for the Federal Reserve, a woman with a corner office, a retirement plan, and a future that stretched out before her, like an open road. That was 15 years ago, before Marcus Aldridge's company had purchased the small tech startup where her husband Daniel had poured his life savings, his dreams, his soul, before the restructuring that promised growth, but delivered pink slips, before Daniel, unable to bear the weight of failure, had walked into their garage one October evening and never walked out. Before the medical bills from her own breakdown had devoured their savings, before the whispers in academic circles about her instability had closed every door she'd once walked through with confidence. Now she carried trays. She smiled at people who didn't see her. She survived, and every single night she went home to a studio apartment in Rogers Park and remembered what it felt like to matter. Sophie had served Marcus Aldridge 3 times before tonight. Each time he hadn't recognized her. Why would he? To him she was furniture, a mechanism for delivering food and removing plates. He probably couldn't describe her face if his life depended on it. But she knew him. Oh, she knew him. The first time she'd seen him walk through the Meridian Club's doors 2 months ago. Her hands had trembled so violently she'd nearly dropped a tray of champagne flutes. She'd stood frozen behind the bar, watching him laugh with the maître d', watching him move through the space with the easy confidence of a man who had never once questioned his right to exist in it. The man who had signed the papers. The man whose signature on an acquisition contract had set in motion the chain of dominoes that destroyed her entire world. And he had no idea who she was. That first night, she'd considered quitting, walking out, never coming back. But then she thought about her rent, about her student loans that still haunted her despite the bankruptcy, about the fact that she was 36 years old, with a PhD she couldn't use, and a resume gap that screamed broken. So she swallowed the bile rising in her throat. She steadied her hands, and she served him his Bordeaux with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Tonight was different, though. Tonight something in the air felt charged, electric, like the moment before a thunderstorm, when the atmosphere itself seems to hold its breath. Sophie approached table 12 with a pitcher of sparkling water. Her movements were practiced, economical. She could hear Marcus before she reached the table. His voice, that particular timbre of arrogance that came from never being told no. "The Vermeer family is bleeding sentiment," he was saying, gesturing with a breadstick like a conductor with a baton. "They think legacy matters more than profit margins. That's why they're losing. That's why we'll win." Gerald and Philip nodded like dashboard bobbleheads. Sophie began refilling the water glasses. Her hands were steady. Her face was blank. She was a ghost, a shadow. Nothing. But as she leaned in to fill Marcus's glass, she heard him say something. Something that made the world tilt on its axis. It's like that tech company we gutted back in '09. What was it called? Something solar? Solar Dynamics? Her hand froze. The pitcher hovered over his glass. "Solar Bridge Tech," Philip offered. Right, Marcus laughed. Casual, dismissive sound. "We bought it for the patents and stripped the rest. What was it, like 200 employees? All gone in a quarter. But those patents made us $500 million. Best investment we ever made." Sophie's vision blurred. The edges of the room went soft, unfocused. 200 employees. She remembered that number. She'd read it in the Tribune article. She'd memorized every word of that article. Every statistic, every cold clinical assessment of what the business journalists had called strategic restructuring. Daniel had been employee number 73. She knew because she'd found his termination letter in his desk drawer. After the funeral, typed on Aldridge Global letterhead, signed by someone in human resources whose name she'd never learned. Not by Marcus himself, of course. Men like Marcus didn't sign termination letters. They simply made the decisions that required them, Best investment we ever made. The words echoed in her skull, bouncing around like shrapnel. She finished pouring the water. Her hand didn't shake. Years of practice had taught her body to function, even when her mind was screaming. She stepped back from the table. Professional, invisible, nothing. Marcus didn't even glance at her. He was already moving on to the next topic, the next acquisition, the next company he would consume, the next collection of human lives he would reduce to line items on a balance sheet. Sophie walked back toward the kitchen, one foot in front of the other, her breathing shallow, controlled. She could feel something building inside her chest, something that had been compressed for 15 years under the weight of grief, shame, survival. A pressure that had been building so slowly. She'd almost forgotten it was there. She pushed through the swinging doors into the bright fluorescent hell of the kitchen. The heat hit her like a physical force. The head chef, Maurice, was screaming at a line cook about a sauce that had broken. Someone dropped a pan. The crash was deafening. Sophie stood there for a moment, just breathing, just existing. Then she heard it. Marcus's voice. Sharp, cutting through the ambient noise of the dining room like a knife. Excuse me. Excuse me. She turned. Through the small window in the kitchen door, she could see him. He was half standing at his table, his face red, angry. He was holding up a piece of meat on his fork, like evidence in a trial. This is unacceptable, he bellowed, loud enough that nearby tables were starting to turn. I ordered this medium rare. Medium rare. This is practically raw. Sophie watched him, really watched him. And something inside her, something that had been carefully locked away for 15 years, finally, quietly, irreversibly, broke free. Sophie pushed back through the kitchen doors. She moved with purpose now, not the hurried, deferential shuffle of a server trying to placate an angry customer, but the measured stride of someone who had finally remembered that she was more than her uniform, more than her circumstances, more than the invisible shadow she'd been forced to become. The dining room had gone quiet, that particular silence that descends when a scene is unfolding, when people sense drama and can't look away. Marcus was still standing, still holding his fork aloft like a weapon, his face flushed with indignation, with the absolute certainty that he was right, and the world owed him an apology. This is completely unacceptable, he repeated as Sophie approached. His voice was loud, performative. He was playing to an audience now, demonstrating his power, his willingness to make a scene. I've been coming to this establishment for years, and I've never been served something so poorly prepared. This is an insult. Sophie stopped at the edge of the table. She didn't apologize, didn't offer to take the plate back, didn't do any of the things her training had taught her to do. Instead, she simply looked at him, really looked at him. And for the first time in all the times she'd served him, Marcus Aldridge actually saw her. There was something in her eyes, something that made him pause, something that didn't belong on the face of a waitress in a high-end restaurant. I want to speak to your manager, Marcus said. His voice was slightly less certain now, slightly less loud. Immediately, Sophie felt a strange calm descend over her. It was the calm of having nothing left to lose. The calm of a woman who had already lost everything that mattered and survived it. What could he do to her? Get her fired? She'd been fired before, from better jobs, from a career she'd loved. She'd survived that too. Of course, sir, she said. Her voice was steady, clear. I'll get the manager for you right away. She turned, walked back toward the kitchen, but she didn't go inside. Instead, she walked to the small office behind the bar. The manager, Robert Chen, was doing paperwork. He looked up as she entered. Table 12 wants to speak to you, Sophie said. The steak complaint. Robert sighed, stood, straightened his tie. Aldridge? He asked. Sophie nodded. Robert's expression tightened. Aldridge was a regular, a big spender, the kind of customer you didn't want to upset. I'll handle it, he said. But Sophie put a hand on his arm. Robert, she said quietly, before you go out there, there's something I need to tell you. Robert looked at Sophie with concern. In the 8 months she'd worked at the Meridian Club, she'd never been anything but professional, never caused a problem, never made a scene. She was one of his best servers, reliable, competent, forgettable in the way that excellent service should be. What is it? He asked. Sophie took a breath. I'm going to quit tonight, she said, simple, direct. Robert blinked. What, why? Did Aldridge say something to you? Because if he was inappropriate, no, Sophie interrupted. Nothing like that. But I need you to do something for me. One thing, and then I'll walk out of here. And you'll never see me again. Robert studied her face. Something in her expression made him uneasy. What do you need? When you bring him the check, Sophie said. I want to be the one to deliver it. Not you, me, Robert frowned. That's irregular. He asked for the manager. I know, Sophie said. But I need this, Robert, please. I've never asked you for anything. I've worked every holiday, every double shift you needed covered. I've never complained, never caused problems. I'm asking for this one thing. There was something in her voice, something raw, desperate, absolutely resolute. Robert had managed restaurants for 20 years. He'd seen enough human drama to recognize when someone was standing on the edge of something. Sophie, he said carefully, what's going on? She met his eyes. Justice, she said simply, or as close to it as I'm ever going to get. Robert wanted to ask more, wanted to understand, but something in her face told him this was not a conversation she was willing to have. Not now, maybe not ever. He thought about Aldridge out there, demanding, entitled, making a scene over a steak. He thought about Sophie, quiet Sophie who never complained, who always showed up, who had shadows in her eyes that spoke of a pain he'd never asked about. All right, he said finally. I'll go smooth things over. Comp the steak, maybe the whole meal. And when I bring the check, you can deliver it. Sophie's shoulders sagged with relief. Thank you, she whispered. Robert nodded, straightened his tie again. But Sophie, whatever you're planning, be smart about it, she smiled. It was a sad smile, a smile that had made peace with consequences. I'm just going to deliver a check, Robert. That's all. Robert walked out into the dining room. Sophie watched through the small window in the office door. She saw him approach table 12, saw the deferential bow, the apologetic gestures. Marcus was sitting now, still angry, but willing to be placated by the manager's attention, the performance of subservience. She saw Robert speaking, saw Marcus's face shift from anger to satisfaction. The meal would be comped, an apology offered, honor restored. In Marcus Aldridge's world, this was how things worked. You made a fuss. Someone in authority came. You were appeased. The natural order maintained. Sophie stood in the office for a long moment after Robert left, just breathing, just gathering herself. She could hear her own heartbeat, loud, insistent in her ears, like a drum counting down to something irreversible. She walked to Robert's desk, found what she needed, a pen, a notepad with the Meridian Club's letterhead. She sat down in Robert's chair. The leather was warm, expensive. She stared at the blank paper for a moment. Then she began to write. The words came easily. They'd been forming in her mind for 15 years, crystallizing, waiting for this exact moment. She wrote quickly. Her handwriting was neat, precise, the handwriting of a woman who had once graded papers and published research, a woman who understood the weight of words. When she finished, she read it over once, twice. Then she folded the paper carefully, precisely. She slipped it into the pocket of her vest, right over her heart. Outside, she could hear the restaurant coming back to life. The incident at table 12 was over. The ambient noise of conversation and clinking silverware had resumed. The world had moved on. It always did. Sophie removed her name tag, the little rectangle of plastic with Sophie printed in neat letters. She looked at it for a moment. Then she set it on Robert's desk. She wouldn't need it anymore. She walked to the small mirror near the door, the one the servers used to check their appearance before going out to the floor. She looked at herself. Really looked. The woman staring back at her was tired, older than her years. But there was something else there now, something that hadn't been there when her shift started. Determination, purpose, a quiet fire that had been banked for so long. She'd almost forgotten it existed. She untied her hair, let it fall around her shoulders. It was still dark, still thick, still the hair of the woman she'd been before the world had taught her to make herself small. She straightened her vest. Smoothed down her shirt, she looked like a server. But she didn't feel like one anymore. For the first time in 15 years, Dr. Sophie Laurent felt like herself again. She took one last deep breath. Then she walked out into the dining room. The lights seemed brighter, the sounds sharper. Everything had a clarity she hadn't experienced in years. She walked to the bar where Robert was processing Marcus's check. The total was substantial. Even with the comped steak, $372 for a meal for 3 people. Robert had added a note at the bottom. With our sincere apologies for the error, we hope to serve you again soon. Sophie took the leather check presenter from Robert's hands. He looked at her, really looked at her, and for just a moment, she thought she saw understanding in his eyes. Thank you, Robert, she said quietly. For everything, he nodded. Said nothing. Sometimes silence was the only appropriate response. Sophie turned. The check presenter felt heavy in her hands, heavier than it should, as if it contained more than just a bill and a credit card slip, as if it contained every moment of grief, every fragment of rage, every shard of helplessness she'd carried for 15 years. She walked across the dining room, toward table 12, toward Marcus Aldridge, toward the reckoning. Marcus was laughing when Sophie arrived at the table. A full-throated, satisfied laugh. Gerald had said something amusing. Something about the Vermeer family's desperation. Something cruel, dismissive. The kind of joke that men like Marcus told in rooms like this. Rooms where consequences were abstract concepts. Concepts that happened to other people. He didn't notice Sophie approaching. Not at first. He was too busy enjoying his own power, his own certainty that the world would always bend to accommodate him. Your check, Mr. Aldridge. Sophie's voice cut through his laughter like a blade through silk. Clean, sharp, precise. He looked up. And for the second time that evening, he actually saw her. But this time was different. Her hair was down, loose around her shoulders. Her name tag was gone, and there was something in her eyes, something that made the smile fade from his face, something that looked almost like recognition. But that was impossible. He didn't know this woman. Sophie placed the leather check presenter on the table. Not hastily, not with the deferential quick movements of a server trying to be invisible, but deliberately, with weight, with intention. I believe you'll find everything in order, she said. Her voice was different now, not the practiced professional neutrality she'd maintained all evening, but something else, something educated, something that carried authority. Marcus frowned, picked up the check presenter, opened it. The bill was there, itemized, the steak marked as comped. He glanced at it, nodded, pulled out his black American Express card, the one with no spending limit, the one that announced his importance to anyone who saw it. He placed the card in the presenter, but before he could close it, Sophie spoke again. There's something else in there, Mr. Aldridge. Her voice was steady, calm. Something I think you should read. Marcus looked at her sharply. Gerald and Philip had gone silent. The air at the table had changed, grown thick, tense. Marcus opened the presenter again. Behind the bill, folded neatly, was a piece of paper. The Meridian Club's letterhead. He pulled it out, unfolded it. His eyes scanned the first line, then stopped. His face went pale. Actually pale. The color draining from his cheeks like water from a sink. The note was handwritten, neat, precise, professional. It read, Dear Mr. Aldridge, you don't remember me. Why would you? I was never important enough to remember. But 15 years ago, your company, Aldridge Global Holdings, acquired a small tech startup called SolarBridge Tech. You bought it for the patents. 200 employees lost their jobs in what you called strategic restructuring. Employee number 73 was named Daniel Laurent. He was my husband. He was 34 years old. He had a master's degree in engineering. He loved hiking and bad science fiction movies. He believed in the future. He believed in the company he'd helped build. When he lost his job, he lost more than income. He lost his purpose, his identity, his hope. 3 months after receiving his termination letter, signed by someone in your HR department whose name I've forgotten. Because people like you don't sign your own execution orders. My husband walked into our garage and hanged himself. I found him. I cut him down. I held him while we waited for the ambulance that couldn't save him. The medical bills from my subsequent breakdown bankrupted me. The whispers about my instability cost me my career as an economics professor at Northwestern. I lost everything. My husband, my career, my home. My future, all of it, gone because you needed patents. Because 200 people were just numbers on a spreadsheet. Because profit mattered more than lives. Marcus's hands were shaking. Actually shaking. The paper trembled in his grip. He kept reading. Unable to stop. Unable to look away. For 15 years I've served people like you. People who don't see me. People who think I'm invisible. People who believe that money erases culpability. That distance absolves responsibility. That success justifies collateral damage. Tonight you made a scene about a steak. A piece of meat cooked 3 degrees too rare. You demanded to speak to a manager. You performed your outrage for an audience. You demonstrated your power over people you consider beneath you. And all I could think was, my husband is dead because you wanted patents. I'm serving you water because you wanted patents. 200 families were destroyed because you wanted patents. And you don't even remember. The note continued. I'm not writing this because I expect an apology. Men like you don't apologize. I'm not writing this because I expect justice. There is no justice for people like me. I'm writing this because I need you to know. I need you to understand that every decision you make, every acquisition you approve, every strategic restructuring you implement has a human cost. Real people, real lives, real consequences. Tonight, for just one moment, I wanted you to see me, to know my name, to understand that I'm not invisible, that I never was, that none of us are. My name is Dr. Sophie Laurent. I have a PhD in economics from MIT. I published 17 peer-reviewed papers. I taught at Northwestern University. I had a life, a future, a husband who loved me. And you took it all away without even knowing I existed. Marcus looked up from the note. His face was ashen. His eyes met Sophie's, and in that moment he saw her. Really saw her. Not as a server, not as furniture, but as a human being whose life he had irrevocably destroyed. The last line of the note, Sophie said quietly, her voice carrying in the silent restaurant, tells you my maiden name. The name I used when I was Dr. Laurent. The name you would have seen if you'd ever bothered to read the impact reports. If you'd ever asked about the human cost of your decisions. Marcus's eyes dropped back to the paper, to the final line, written in the same neat, precise handwriting, just 3 words. But they hit him like a physical blow. Sophie Vermeer Laurent. The room spun. Vermeer, the family whose company he was currently destroying. The family whose legacy he'd dismissed as sentiment less than an hour ago. The family he was gutting for profit margins. She was one of them. And he'd already destroyed her once before. The silence in the restaurant was absolute. Suffocating. Every eye was on table 12. On the billionaire CEO who had gone completely white. On the waitress standing above him with her head held high. Sophie reached into her vest pocket, pulled out her name tag, the one that said Sophie. She placed it on the table next to the check presenter. I quit, Mr. Aldridge, she said. Her voice was steady, strong. And I hope every time you sign an acquisition, every time you approve a restructuring, every time you calculate profit margins, you remember this moment. You remember Daniel Laurent. Employee number 73. You remember that numbers on a spreadsheet are people. And people have names, she turned. Walked away from the table, away from Marcus Aldridge. Away from 15 years of invisible servitude. She walked through the dining room with her head high, past the shocked faces, past Robert, who nodded at her with something that looked like respect, past the kitchen, where Maurice was still screaming about sauces. She walked out the front door of the Meridian Club, into the humid Chicago night, into uncertainty, into a future she couldn't predict, but for the first time in 15 years, she walked as herself. Dr. Sophie Vermeer Laurent, a woman who had survived the unsurvivable, a woman who had found her voice, a woman who was no longer invisible. Behind her, in the silent restaurant, Marcus Aldridge sat frozen, the note still in his hands, the name Vermeer burning into his consciousness, understanding finally that some debts can never be paid, that some consequences can never be avoided, that some ghosts don't rattle chains, they simply return your credit card with a name you haven't heard. And a truth you can never forget. If this story touched your heart and you want to see more powerful emotional stories that remind us of our shared humanity, please subscribe to the channel, hit that notification bell so you never miss a story, and leave a like to help us reach more people who need to hear these messages. Thank you for watching.